We are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today we are going to talk about another Dice Throne hero. We're going deep. We're doing the review and analysis on Vampire Lord. Now, before we even start on anything else, I want to be clear. I am only going to be talking about the updated Vampire Lord. So there is a version of this character that existed prior to July of 2022. That is not the pamphlet that we're going to be talking about. This is only going to be discussion around the updated Vampire Lord. And primarily, this is going to be coming from a competitive angle. So, a lot of Dice Throne heroes are playable at the kitchen table. You can have a lot of fun playing this game at the kitchen table. I think that's probably how most of us were introduced to it. But this video is going to be about strategy and analysis for how you would use the Vampire Lord in a tournament or at the competitive table. That's the angle I'm taking with it. It should probably also be said that all of my analysis is based on my biases and my tendencies as a player. So if you don't have a play style that fits exactly the same with mine, there's probably still something of value you could learn here, as in learning to play against players who think like I do. But the specific strategy tips are only going to be applicable if you like to play the game in at least a similar way to the way that I do. All right, so we're going to start by taking a look at the updated pamphlet for this hero. So there's two unique statuses, and bleed we've seen on a few other heroes. So let's take a closer look at these status effects, and we're going to start with blood power. Now this is the bread and butter, or perhaps life's blood would be a better cliche to apply, of the Vampire Lord. This is the most important status effect. This is one of the most important elements of how you're going to want to play this character. So let's dig in. You have a stack limit of 5 on this ability, and you can activate them for a variety of different effects. So if you have 1 token, you can spend this to add 3 damage to your attack. This counts as an attack modifier. Now, in my opinion, this is the correct play. Almost every time. I think the way to play Vampire Lord the vast majority of the time is to be as aggressive as possible and take advantage of how powerful +3 attack is. You want to be spending these blood power as quickly as you gain them. Again, that way they're not vulnerable to removal, transfer, or being messed with in any kind of way by your opponent, and you're converting them immediately into victory points, essentially. Damage on your opponent is a form of chasing victory points in this game. All right, if you have 2 of these tokens, you can remove a status effect from a chosen player. So this will be situationally useful. We are giving up 6 damage to do that, so I think you should crunch the numbers in that way. So for example, let's look at a Shadow Thief who's in the shadows, and you go, I really want to push an attack through here. If I spend 2 blood power, if I don't take a turn off to build up my resources, and I actually want to push this through, if I'm going to commit 2 blood power to remove a shadows from the thief, then I think I need to be able to get something that's worth giving up 6 damage. I need to be pushing for lethal. I need to be making sure that it's a worthwhile and efficient investment. Now, there are going to be exceptions to this, of course. If you have burn on you, for example, and you're going to start your turn, yes, it's worth it to spend 2 blood power to remove that burn. But to use it proactively, to get that annoying agility out of there. Like, agility is one of those status effects that I think I would have a really hard time removing it. Low cost removals, sure, get that agility out of the way, make Black Widow fight you honestly. This is a high cost removal. Spending 2 blood power is a big cost. Yes, it's a useful effect, and yes, there are going to be game situations where you're going to want to use it, but I would be cautious in how I apply this. I would think hard before giving up something that's potentially worth 6 damage, or if we look at what you can spend 3 blood power on, drawing 2 cards. That is a hugely beneficial effect. Do I want to use 2 of my tokens to prevent me from getting to that 3 to get access to those cards? Again, situationally, it will be appropriate. But in my opinion, the spending 2 tokens to remove a status effect is one of the more, it's one of the options you choose less frequently. So spending 3 tokens to draw 2 cards, that is, I don't think I have to explain how powerful card draw is in this game. Double Up and Triple Up are 2 of the most powerful cards we have, and this is essentially a double up that you can fire off at will, kind of. 4 tokens, heal to the amount of damage you successfully dealt this roll phase. Okay. So first of all, you have to connect the damage. If somebody fogs it and evades away from it, or double agilities, or protects and cuts it down, whatever the damage is that successfully connects is what matters here. This is not like Artificer checking to see if there's 6 incoming and then activating Healbot no matter what other effects get played. This damage has to be dealt. It has to connect. And that is why I think the 4 token heal is a trap. I think it's tantalizing. You look at it and go, wow, if I could have a turn where I deal 10 damage, then I heal 10 damage, that's like doing 20. That's a delta of 20 in one turn. And that is flashy. That is very cool. In fact, shout out to Argon Jedit for on Board Game Geek for his strategy series. I actually want to quote something from it. So this is under perfect conditions. You get your ultimate for 10 damage, three damage from Blood Power, 5 from Limb, 3 from Blood Boil for 21 incoming damage, which could allow you to heal 21 for a net delta, a net swing of 42 points. That looks awesome. And in my opinion, it is a trap. It's a trap. It's a trap. I do not save my Blood Power up to go for the big heal. If it comes to me, if the way the game plays out, I have the Blood Power to get a heal, that's cool. I'm not saying you should walk away from it if it comes to you. What I'm saying is it's not going to come to you. If you want to do the big heal, you're going to have to force it. And in order to force it, you're going to have to be giving up damage on other turns. I think you are better served using those 4 blood tokens for a total buff of 12 attack. Like, that's more than a turn's worth of damage spread out across 4 turns, as opposed to trying to heal yourself for a big heal at some point in the game. I just do not feel like the heal is a meaningful, it doesn't do enough for it to be something that you shape your whole game plan around. And if you want to do it, you kind of have to shape your whole game plan around it, in my opinion. All right, finally, if your attack successfully deals damage to an opponent afflicted with 2 bleed, you gain a blood token. That is very important to the Vampire Lord's economy. Blood Power is one of the most powerful tokens we have in the whole game. And we're about to have Whiplash because Mesmerize is one of the weakest status effect tokens we have in the whole game. So this is a stack limit of 1, and you can force an opponent to re-roll a die, but not all the time. So you roll something, and I decide I don't like that roll. I roll a d6, and if I hit a 1/3 chance, if I hit a 5 or a 6, then I can force you to re-roll your die. So 1/3 of the time, I have a 1 in 6 chance to push you off of something. Not an impressive status effect. I do not care about this status effect at all. Next, we have Bleed, which is a very good status effect. Not as good as Blood Power, but still very good. Persistent damage. Yes, people have the ability to roll a die at the start of their turn, and if they hit a 5 or a 6, they take the bleed off. So 1/3 of the time, it goes away. But I've seen bleeds applied on turn 1 last the whole game for 7, 8. That's a whole turn's worth of damage if that thing stays on there for a while. And with stack limit 2, you're able to potentially do as much as a burn, 2 damage per turn. That adds up very quickly. And let's not forget the additional benefit of getting extra blood power if you've got the bleed stacks on people. Lastly, let's take a look at the Vampire Lord's dice layout. It is a 3-2-1 die face, which is normally what I refer to as the most forgiving die face. But the thing about the Vampire Lord is some of these roll objectives are quite awkward. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Vampire Lord's board. As always, the art is fantastic. I distinctly remember the first time I looked at this board, and Rend, Gouge in particular, really stood out to me. There's something viscerally kind of disturbing about the claws on the Vampire Lord, and I love it. It should be disturbing. So the same thing I say every time we look at one of these boards, gosh, Manny's art sure is beautiful, and this is no exception. In fact, aesthetically, this might be one of my favorite characters in the game. All right, so let's zoom in a little closer and take a look at the Vampire Lord's actual role objectives, and this is where we're going to get into the crunchy territory of how to play this character. So to start, we have Gouge. Now, as a basic attack, 3, 5, 7 is kind of an odd spread. Starting at 3 is very, very bad. We never want to activate a 3 Gouge. That's pretty awful. But it's very rare that you are going to fall into a basic attack with only 3 of the die faces. So getting 5 and of course 7 is going to be better. Now 7 is still basically gets us to average damage, and the 4 of a kind is not going to trigger that often. While this power can, on 4 of a kind, give you a blood power, and if it does, you need to just immediately add 3 more damage to it. So we'd be looking at a 6, 8, 10, and that's an incredibly strong basic attack. However, how often are we going to get the blood power from that 4 of a kind? Uh, I think this is a power you don't feel bad picking if you've already got the blood power on your board, or if you know you're going to generate it with the 4 of a kind. And even if you don't have the blood power, 7 damage on a basic attack is, I mean, it's exactly average. It's sure 7 isn't going to get through, probably, depending upon the defense of who you're attacking into, but it's respectable enough that I think you can do it and not feel bad about it. Now, this ability has 2 upgrades. So Gouge 2, it costs you 1 coin. The damage remains the same, but the blood power goes from 4 down to 3. This is significantly easier to get. To get 3 of a kind is going to be easier than 4 of a kind. Is it worth a coin? Probably, especially early game. If this is able to go off a couple of times, you've made your investment back for sure. How reliable is it? I am definitely more impressed with Gouge 3. This costs 2 coins, which I think is a fair investment. It remains it keeps the 3 of a kind, which fine, but it increases the damage to 4, 6, 8, which is actually going to be 7, 9, 11, which is very good in my opinion. I like 11 damage basic attacks. So I think either of these upgrades are probably purchasable, although I could see myself selling Gouge 2 in any game where I'm even slightly pressured on combat points. Okay, moving on, we're going to drop down and take a look at Sanguimancy. Now, this is the Vampire Lord's setup power. I mentioned before when I was talking about blood power, spending 2 to remove a status effect, how if somebody's sitting in the shadows, maybe you just go for a Sanguimancy. And you're okay with that, and you use that as a setup turn. This is a perfectly respectable way to start the game off. You get a little bit of healing. I mean, it's not a meaningful amount of healing. There are many characters whose defense rolls will be able to do enough return damage to you to offset that healing, but it's something. What matters with Sanguimancy, though, is the 3 blood power. The blood power is the core economy of the Vampire Lord. That 3 blood power, you read that as 12 damage. So this is a 12 damage attack, essentially, spread out across 3 turns. Yes, it is vulnerable to status removal, but if somebody tries to come at you like that, you spend the 3 blood power to draw a card instead. Or draw 2 cards instead, and I feel good about that. All right, let's take a look at the upgrade. Sanguimancy 2 costs 2 to get into play. It increases the heal from 2 to 3. I think that's negligible. And it gives you a kind of weird backup roll of presence. This is never going to be something you roll for. This is going to be the kind of thing you end up on because somebody messed with your dice. 2 blood power and 1 card is not a great power. Overall, I think this upgrade is a very safe sell. Perhaps I would even go so far as to call it an auto sell because you're essentially paying 2 coins for 1 additional healing on a power that you only want to roll once or twice in the whole game. And I guess maybe in a world where you see this upgrade turn 1 and you also have 6 it, so you feel like you can maybe force it. No, even there, I feel like Sanguimancy, more than maybe any other card in the Vampires kit, this is probably a safe sell. All right, let's move up to Glamour. So this ability uses 3 of the 4/5 die faces. You gain 1 coin, you gain 1 mesmerize, and 4 undefendable damage. So in a vacuum, this is a very unimpressive power. You essentially deal 4 damage and gain coin. Mesmerize, I mentioned before, is not a status effect I care about and would not chase. So to me, that effect on this is somewhere between negligible and irrelevant. Uh, for undefendable damage, though, with the existence of blood power, I do think we need to mention that could actually easily be 7 undefendable damage. And that puts it in the territory of like a solid mini ult. That's actually pretty good. When you also think about how many characters out there have defenses that Vampire Lord might not want to crash into, in matchups where you really want undefendable damage, when you don't want to let that Shadow Thief try to step into the shadows, where you don't want to eat that return damage from the Pyromancer, going after something that only requires 3 faces of your 4s and 5s, and you can turn it into it basically spot even average undefendable damage. I think this is actually a pretty solid power. The combat point being added in feels fine. This is not a character that really struggles for economy, and the reason for that is abilities like this, where you get combat points while also doing something you kind of want to be doing anyway. To take a look at the upgrade on this card, Glamour 2 costs 2 combat points. It retains the 1 CP, it retains the 1 Mesmerize, it increases the damage from 4 to 5, which means we could be pushing 8 with the Blood Power, and it grants Influence. You get a Mesmerize and 2 Bleeds. This is better than nothing. The 2 Bleeds are legitimately better than a whiff, especially if they stick. If 2 Bleeds are on for 3 turns, we're now talking about like average damage off of a kind of weak dice roll. But it's not something we go for. We never, ever want Influence. There are much better things we can do with our turn than hope our opponent doesn't have status removal and hope that we can live long enough for the chip damage on bleed to really make an impact. Getting 2 bleeds on your opponent with Vampire Lord does make a difference, because that's one of the ways that we can get blood power into our economy. So this isn't a bad effect, but this is very much a fallback ability that you're going to take instead of having to say, I whiff. As far as the upgrade to Glamour itself, the +1 damage for 2 combat points. This is not a character that's going to struggle with combat point economy as much as some other heroes. So maybe, depending upon the specific game, I think you could afford to play this upgrade. And maybe if it's a matchup where you're really worried about the opponent's defense, where there's a strong defense that you just do not want to keep crashing into, like an upgraded Paladin or Pyro and Shadow Thief are kind of the cliche go-to examples of defenses you don't want to have to deal with. Maybe in those matchups, you spend this upgrade and you try to avoid defendable damage. I feel like more often than not, I'm pretty comfortable selling Glamour. It does the majority of what I want it to do without having to invest any combat points in it. And often I would rather have combat points available to spend on things like double up, triple up. All right, moving down to Rend. So this is a sort of atypical full house. Normally when we see these kinds of powers, it's a couple of the most common die face and 3 of the 4/5 die face. This is 3 of the easy to get die face and 2 6s, which means you are not going to be playing this power that often. It's probably going to be, roll 1 looked ulty, roll 2 I tried to go for it, and roll 3 I had to bail out and go for a Rend. That said, as awkward as it is going to be to try to roll for this power sometimes, dealing 6 damage, and then the 3 riders, which could, the blood power turns that 6 into 9, drawing an extra card is always good, and potentially the dice could just turn that 6 into 9. And if you already have the blood power, well, now we can turn that 9 into 12, which is a huge amount of damage. Now we're in alt territory of damage for something that only required 2 6s. But again, it requires 2 6s, which is not something you can really count on. So this is an ability that if I get it, yes, I will take it. But am I going to chase it? Probably not. I think the majority of the time when I end up on this, it's because I wanted to go after an alt and I couldn't quite get there and had to bail and take what the dice gave me. Looking at the upgrade, this is a 2 combat point upgrade. We give 6 damage and we roll 5 dice, but the ons don't become X's, so you're still only going to be able to draw 1 card or gain 1 blood power. Potentially, you could get 5 extra damage off those rider dice, which puts us at 11, and then if you have a pre-existing blood power, that puts us at 14, which puts this thing into very good alt territory. So this power does have some top end like burst potential. In my opinion, this is not a power I want to chase. Even if I get it, it can be awkward. So this is an upgrade I feel very comfortable selling. I almost call it an auto sell, except that it's really hard to turn your nose up at such high amount of damage. Like the ultimate level of damage that this thing is putting out without having to actually roll an ultimate is worth remarking on. However, the awkwardness and difficulty of getting there and the unreliable of I think there are almost always going to be better things you can do with 2 combat points than invest in this upgrade that you might for a power you might not even be able to activate in the whole game. Okay. Moving on to the small straight. So small straights are one of those powers that I subject to a little harsher scrutiny than some of the other role objectives because you get them so often just first roll. The dice just, oh, hey, there's a small straight. It happens a lot. So these tend to be powers that you roll frequently just because the dice give them to you. So with that framework, let's take a look at what Possess does for us. Deal 7 damage with 1 rider that could potentially either give you a bleed, which is good, or a mesmerize, which is not good. I am okay with the 7 damage because we're right there at average, and if you have an existing blood power, you can push that up a little bit higher. I do like the chance of inflicting bleed. Taking a look at the upgrade, Possess 2 costs 2 combat points. It increases the damage by 1, and it gives you the option to inflict a bleed or gain mesmerize. Maybe less than Gouge, but more than probably any other ability on the Vampire Large board. I think this is an upgrade that you want. I suppose I should comment on Draw Blood. Adding 2 blood power, sure, we always want blood power, but not at the expense of our whole turn. The other ability that lets us to take a turn off to gain some blood power, uh, Sanguimancy, that's doing a little bit of healing for us, and it's giving us more blood power. So I do not like Draw Blood. This is clearly a fallback of some kind. And like a lot of these fallback powers, it's better than saying the word scratch. It's better than missing totally, but it's not great. But that's not why you buy this upgrade. You buy this upgrade because small straights come to you pretty frequently, whether you're asking for them, chasing after them, or not. 8 damage is awesome. 8 becomes 11 once you spend the blood power on it, and you get to choose between bleed and mesmerize. I think that's the most meaningful part of this upgrade is easy roll objective that you're probably going to take every game a couple of times just because it comes up, and you have the option of guaranteeing the good outcome and avoiding the bad. Yeah, I think this is worth 2 combat points unless you're in one of those games where your coin purse is running dry already and you're like choosing between being able to play this or have that available for the not this time or the tip it or whatever once you get into the roll phase. Generally speaking, I like this upgrade at more or less any point in the game. I like it a great deal. All right, let's move down to Blood Magic, the large straight. So, you hit a large straight, you gain blood power, you inflict bleed. I like both those words, and you deal 8 damage. You can also spend a mesmerize to make the attack undefendable. In my opinion, this is the only good use for mesmerize. Using mesmerize as intended, as it's printed to try to disrupt a roll, sure, I'll do it. Like, I don't have anything else to do with the mesmerize, so I'll definitely be willing to do it to try to disrupt my opponent. But most of the time, it does nothing. And even when it goes off and makes them re-roll a die, sometimes that does nothing. So I prefer high percentage consistent plays. That's something I like as a player. Therefore, Blood Magic is the place where I look to spend Mesmerize to make my 8 or 11 damage undefendable. And you kind of have to think of it as a guaranteed 11, because unless your opponent has exactly bye to clip the blood power right as you get it, you're guaranteed to have a blood power. So it's going to be a very rare and narrow situation where this only deals 8. I guess there's that new X-Men character that prevents you from gaining status effects. So there's a couple of ways you could be forced to choose this power and not have the blood power available, but that's going to be rare. The majority of the time, this is going to do the 11, which is awesome. You could even call it 12 if the bleed is able to go off. And if the person already has 1 bleed on them, what this does is let you just refresh your blood power and have it ready to go again. So this is like most large straights, this is very, very good. If it comes to you, you're going to feel good about it. How hard do I chase this power when I have things like, if I have a gouge upgrade, I'm probably not chasing a large straight. And in most competitive situations, if I'm on roll 2 and I have a small straight, I'm not chasing the large straight unless my opponent has no cards in hand and or no combat points. And even if they have no combat points, I probably won't chase the large straight because they might have getting paid. to get paid into something to mess up my large straight, leaving me with no rerolls remaining. That's just the danger of large straights. They're risk versus reward, like everything in Dice Throne. The large straights are often very, very good, but also very, very susceptible to your opponent messing with them with low-cost cards. So you have to be careful. All right, let's take a look at the upgrade for Blood Magic. This gives us Blood Magic 2. It costs 2 to get into play. It turns the damage undefendable by itself, thus giving Mesmerize no utility in the game. And it adds Gash as a fallback. Probably you missed your ult, so you end up with 5 undefendable damage. That is okay. I mean, 5 undefendable damage probably becomes 8 with Blood Power, so that's actually pretty respectable. Out of all the fallbacks we've talked about today, this is one that I'm not going to feel bad declaring, especially if I have the Blood Power available, or if I'm specifically in a matchup where undefendable damage is very highly valued. The problem with this upgrade, it's good. I like it a lot, but the problem with it is how often are you going to hit those large straights? Am I going to invest the combat points in this and then never see a large straight for the rest of the game? Maybe. It happens. I mean, that happens when you're playing Shadow Thief, and that guy has more tricks and ways to manipulate his way into a large straight than anybody in the game. And sometimes the dice just don't line up. Probably I pay for this upgrade if I have the combat points available. I do like the guaranteed undefendable damage. Seeing the number 8 with that red background feels so juicy, knowing what Blood Power can do, knowing how the bleed, all this stuff works together just to make the Vampire Lord really be able to push some damage through. I do like this power. But again, there's going to be games where you just can't invest 2 combat points in something you maybe roll once or twice. So your mileage may vary. Earlier in the game, like most upgrades, the earlier you see them in the game, the more likelihood that you're going to get value out of them, and the better you're going to feel about having invested in it. All right, Bloodthirst. Let's talk about the mini alt. This is 2 blood power plus 5 undefendable damage. Considering we just talked about a fallback roll that does 5 undefendable damage, this feels a little anemic. Knowing that we get blood power as soon as we activate it, that means it's actually going to be 8 undefendable damage, so that does make it feel a little bit better. I mean, let's be real. You're not chasing Bloodthirst. You're chasing an alt and you get pushed off of it and end up with Bloodthirst. That's what happens. That's why you declare this power. Uh, there are characters who have mini alts like Black Widow that I would absolutely chase and I would stop at the mini alt. Pyro is another one where I like the mini alt almost more than her actual ult. That's not the case here. If you end up on this, I don't think you feel that bad about declaring it, but this is probably not an ability you want as anything other than a backup for a missed ult. Looking at the upgrade, costs 2 combat points, you get 3 blood power and 6 undefendable damage, and you gain the hemorrhage fallback roll, which inflicts 2 bleed and does 2 collateral to all opponents. Now this could be meaningful in a PvE setting, Dice Throne missions, Dice Throne adventures, and certainly in multiplayer you get more value out of that. In 1v1, hemorrhage is a terrible fallback. Sure, if there's a hero that you're facing that has a defense roll, that's going to be real problematic, and it's so important that you avoid the defense roll that you're willing to settle for 2 collateral. It's important to also note that 2 collateral means you can't put blood power into this. I guess you could think of it maybe as 4 undefendable because the 2 bleeds are likely going to go off next turn. I mean, 60% chance of going off next turn. And that makes it look a little better, but like a lot of fallbacks, you take it because it's what's available, but it's not what you were targeting. I'm not super impressed with this upgrade. Looking at the base power, getting 1 additional blood power, getting 1 additional damage, yes, that's good. But again, do I want to invest my combat points in making a power I'm not really trying to roll for better? I think most of the time the answer is no. There's almost always going to be something you can spend that combat point on. Well, those 3 combat points on, the 2 plus the one you get for selling this, that's going to better serve you in the game. So I'm not a fan of this upgrade. Let's drop down to the Vampire Lord's defense, Immortal Flesh. You roll 3 dice. On double hands, you inflict a bleed. On double eyes, you inflict a blood power. And you steal 1 health per 6 rolled. It's a defense. I don't super like this defense roll that much. I'm not afraid of it when I play against it. The bleeds and the blood powers are good. We want those things for sure. And stealing health is cool. And there are some times where you steal 3 health from somebody and it makes a meaningful impact on the game. A lot of dice turn games do come down to 1, 2, 4, 5 health. So the potential of stealing 3, which really creates a swing of 6 on your defense, seems crazy. That seems really strong. It just doesn't happen that often. The upgrade costs 2 and gives you 1 additional die to roll. I feel like this is a sell most of the time. If you're playing against a character that can generate a lot of undefendable, like Ninja, for example, there's no reason to upgrade this. Even if you're playing against somebody who has to crash into your defense every time, like Moon Elf, I'm hard pressed to say that this defense is worth it. Maybe early in the game, but I think there's almost all, much like the mini ult, I think there's almost always going to be other things that you could better send your combat points on. But if you happen to be in one of those games where you have a surplus of combat points and you don't have enough effects to outlet them to, and you're looking for things to spend, I don't think you necessarily feel bad about making your defense 1 die better. It's just the defense is not the cool thing about this character. Like, her damage output is the cool thing about this character, and there's nothing wrong with being a glass cannon, with the exception of her heal. The heal prevents her from being full on glass cannon. All right, let's take a look at the ultimate here. This first line of text: search your deck for any 1 card. I love card search effects in games. I adore being able to go after whatever tool it is I need right away. Unfortunately, it's going to be kind of scripted what you want to go for in this situation. Obviously, if you have an ultimate and you can force a bunch of damage through, top priority is going to be forcing more damage through. So the things you're going to search for are cards that allow you to get additional damage during this window of opportunity when your opponent has to just stop what they're doing, pick up the health dial, and say how much. So seeking out your cards that increase damage is probably priority number 1, unless you really want to go after that heal. Now, I've said over and over again, I don't think the heal is plan A. I think the heal is a little bit of a trap. But given that your ultimate gives you 2 blood power anyway, if you dig into the Vampire Lord's kit and dig out something that lets you get additional blood power after you're already connecting with an ultimate, this would be the opportunity where, if the stars align, this is the place where I would use the heal. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the heal. I think it's tantalizing bait that makes people play differently than me in ways that I think sometimes costs them the game. Everybody should play in the way that they want to, but again, in my opinion, I think the heal is a trap. I think it's tantalizing bait, but I don't think we should go for it. However, every once in a while, the stars will align. You'll get the 2 blood power off the ultimate, and you'll be able to go fish a card out that lets you get more blood power, and then, hey, you get the big heal. That's very cool. I totally agree with those moments. Those high impact, wow moments around the game table are awesome. But generally speaking, I'm playing more with the intent of, hey, I want to win this game, as opposed to, hey, I want to create the most flashy, impactful moments. Sometimes the Venn diagram of those things overlaps, without a doubt. All right, so we're going to put the board away, and we're going to pop the cards back out here and take a look at the rest of the Vampire Lord's kit. All right, we'll start with Blood Flow. So you pay 1, roll 1, and gain half the value as blood power. So very worst case scenario, you pay a coin and you turn it into 3 damage. That's the worst case scenario. That's awesome. This card is very good. I cannot imagine selling this card unless you are in the situation where literally the only other card in your hand is like, not this time, and you know you're going to have to play it next turn to avoid dying. Otherwise, you play this card every game. This card is quite good. Limb from Limb. Costs 1 combat point, attack modifier, roll 5. Most heroes have a card like this. You get 1 additional damage for each of the most common die face, and if at least 3 damage was added, you inflict a bleed. Adding 3 damage is a fairly high percentage. It's not going to happen every time, but for 1 combat point, that's pretty good. Now, all of these attack modifiers have the irritating ability to spend a combat point and a card and then roll all the wrong die faces and do nothing. That is a risk. However, I think as risk averse of a player as I am, I think spending 1 combat point and the attack modifier card most of the time is the correct play. I very rarely to never will sell these cards, and it's always desperate, dire straits. I'm trying to bail myself out of losing the game on the spot if I'm selling an attack modifier like this. This is a playable card. I think you should play this card. Uh, and if you're selling this card, in my opinion, it's because you're in a really, really bad spot, like the example I gave for the previous card. Blood Boil. Cost 0, adds 1 damage. Okay, that's already good. Additionally, add 1 more damage per bleed token the opponent has that you're attacking. So potentially pay 0, add 3 damage. That is incredible. That's incredibly strong. 0 cost, 3 damage. That's huge. Yes, sometimes it'll be 1, sometimes it'll be 2, but you also don't have to play this. You can sit on your hand until you get it set up. This is another card that I think you play almost every game. Uh, 10 times out of 10, with the marginal exception of something like you have this and exactly not this time, and you know you need not this time to avoid losing the game next turn. Very, very narrow situations where you would ever sell this card. It's very good. Dark Omen, pay 4. That's a high price. Gain a Mesmerize, 2 blood power, inflict a bleed on a chosen opponent. I think this is probably worth it. 4 is a huge cost, and it's difficult to evaluate a lot of these pay a huge cost, get all the status effect cards. Yes, the status of, and part of what makes this one more difficult to evaluate than some of the other ones is the fact that Mesmerize is such a no impact status effect. If you have an upgraded large straight, you can delete that line off this card, and then you're looking at pay 4, gain 2 blood power, and inflict a bleed. That doesn't feel like a lot, but I think if you can afford it, it's probably going to be worth it more often than not. If you think about it just in the worst case scenario, that's 6 damage plus 1 damage from, so that's 7 damage. Pay 4 and get a whole turn's worth of damage. And that's if your opponent rolls the bleed right off immediately turn 1. Actually, that'd be, if they roll it off turn 1, then it'd be 0 damage. You'd only do 6. But the point still stands. This card is kind of like paying for to get a whole extra turn's worth of damage output. Now, it's vulnerable to status removal, it's vulnerable to bleed's own self removal, and it's spread out over a couple of turns. So it's the linkage between the value and the cost is not as clear cut as pay 4, deal 7. But that is not a crazy outcome. That's a believable, probably consistent and reliable outcome. So I think more than many of the pay a huge cost, get all the things cards, this is one that I want to try to find the opportunity to play. Plus, you don't have, using Moon Elf as an example, Moon Elf has no economy, has no ability to generate combat points. So paying for to get all of the Moon Elf stuff is really hard. Vampire Lord does. Vampire Lord has other ways to generate combat points and is not going to feel as constrained on the coin purse as some other heroes will. So yeah, you're not going to be able to play this every game because there's going to be games where you're going to be under pressure and you're just not going to be able to afford it, and that's okay. You sell it. But in the games where you can afford it, I think you pay for it, and most of the time you're going to get the value. Bloodletting costs 0, gain a coin and a blood power. Okay. So if you sell this card, you gain a coin. And if you play this card, you gain a coin and a blood power. Yeah, you never sell this card. I don't think anybody needs my analysis on this one. This one's pretty obvious. Consume blood. It costs 0. You can spend 2 blood power and gain 2 combat points per blood power spent. I find it almost impossible to conceive of a gameplay scenario where I would be willing to play this card. I guess if I have no combat points and I need to have well, and it can't be like not this time or something that costs 1 because then I just sell this thing and I'd be able to pay for it. So it would have to be a situation where I have no combat points. I'm facing being killed on my opponent's next turn, and I have exactly something like twice as wild or so wild in my hand, and that's my only way of surviving the next turn, my only defense against lethal. And even then, uh like that's a lot of layers to make this card playable. Just sell this one. Just sell this card. It doesn't make any sense to exchange blood power, one of the most powerful, most important combat or status effects in the entire game, but particularly for this character. This is the backbone, the spine, the life's blood of this character, blood power, and then you would trade it in for combat points. One of the most plentiful resources in the game. I guess Moon Elf might be willing to do that. You know, a character that has no other economy options, maybe in that kit you would play this card. But that's not the Vampire Lord. The Vampire Lord has other combat point generation options within their kit, as well as just the standard income phase combat point generation. A lot of their stuff is not that expensive. A lot of their core gameplay loop doesn't require combat points. You don't really need a lot of these upgrades, though they do help. So just layer after layer of reasons why I will not play this card ever, except for the narrowest, tiniest of barely ever happening circumstances. This card, more than maybe any other card I've reviewed in the entire game of Dice Throne, this card is an auto sell. Man, I don't normally come down on cards that hard. Okay, the Vampire Lord promo. So, like all the promos, you pay nothing. It's a main phase card. You roll a die, and then you draw a card. No, if you roll a 6, you get 3 blood power. As far as promo cards go, that's very useful. Giving Vampire Lord 3 blood power for essentially no cost. I mean, right out of the gate, she could spend that to draw 2 cards, which turns her promo card into a double up, which is incredibly powerful. Double up costs 2, this costs nothing. But in competitive situations, we generally don't play with the promo cards, so it's kind of irrelevant. And even in the games where we do play with the promo cards, you have a 5 out of 6 chance for this to just cycle itself and be a draw card, which is fine. Okay, in summary, I think Vampire Lord post the July 22 or June, the summer 22 update has turned into a damage dealing powerhouse. I do not think she's as much of a glass cannon as the Pyromancer, but I would strongly encourage players to think about her in that same kind of framing. Yes, she does have the ability to shift gears, kind of like the Artificer is a very strong, aggressive character that can come out and do massive damage while relying almost entirely, exclusively on basic attacks and his unique gimmick. In the case of Artificer, bots. In the case of Vampire Lord, blood power. And much like the Artificer, she does have the ability to shift gears into a little more control-y style, where she wants to heal, she wants to draw the game out. In my opinion, the slower drawing the game out, Healy style of play is strictly worse. It is just not as good as the all-out aggressive, just push it to the wall. We're gonna turn right. Kind of a poor reference for this game since we don't turn cards right. Uh, but the aggro mode, I think that's the better way to play Vampire Lord, and I think it's a better way to play Artificer too. And I think Artificer has more flexibility. His ability to switch into a control game exists a little more than Vampire Lord, in my opinion. So that's the way I play this hero. Now, if I'm playing against this hero, the first thing I want to do is get a gauge on whether my opponent agrees with me and intends to play Vampire Lord as the beatdown, or whether they have been tempted by the tantalizing bait of the big heal and they're going to try to play Vampire Lord in a more slow-paced, economy-focused, kind of control-y type way. If my opponent is trying to play control with Vampire Lord, I go all out aggro, and I think I'll get there. There are very few heroes that I think are going to be slower paced in the damage output game than a control focused Vampire Lord, because the Vampire Lord is accepting the damage. Vampire Lord in control mode is accepting, hey, I'm gonna fall behind, and that's okay because what I'm gonna set up is this turn where I get a gigantic heal. And in my opinion, if you're playing against that kind of Vampire Lord, you need to do one of two things. Ideally both, but one of the two is probably going to backbreak this character, like Bane taking Batman over his knee. And that is a well-timed what status effects to just force the blood power off and force them into rebuild mode right when they were getting ready to do their big heal. Often, if you're playing against the control style Vampire Lord, it takes them long enough to set up that big heal that they're in danger of losing the game. And if you can push that big heal off by even a single turn, that's usually all it takes. The other thing you can do is make sure you have dice fix cards available when they get ready to go for the kill shot. The Vampire Lord spends some, let me specify, a control style Vampire Lord spends a lot of the game dirtling, setting up, trying to preserve status effects, and not being that aggressive. Which means you're probably not going to be under a lot of pressure, which also means you should take easier to get roll objectives and save those dice fix cards. And when the vamp goes for that big ultimate, you push them off of it and force a rend instead. That will destroy a Vampire Lord in the control mode, because again, it takes so much of the game to do the setup that by the time the vamp gets ready to hit you with that big haymaker and really flip the table, one, it's incredibly telegraphed. You know it's coming. You can see it from a mile away. So that gives you time to set up your counter. And two, it's just so easy to soak. Even if you can't disrupt the dice, and even if you can't mess with the blood power, the vamp attacks in with their big 10 damage attack that's going to turn into a 20 swing, and you play Not This Time. And essentially, that Not This Time prevents a health swing of 12, because it stops 6 of the damage, which stops 6 of the healing. So you get double value out of already one of the most broken cards in the game. So, for all of these reasons, if I'm facing a Vampire Lord, I want them to go control mode, because I think I can win in that matchup. I think control mode Vampire is objectively slower than the damage output of basically every other hero in the game. And I think playing Vampire Lord in the hyper aggressive way is just more fun. It feels more vampire-y to me, and I feel like I get better results with the hero when I play in that way. So, as always, this is my bias. This is my perspective on how to play this character. So if you have tips, or if you think I missed something, feel free to let me know in the comments below. This has been the Build Phase review and analysis for the Dice Throne hero Vampire Lord. I'm Mr. Ben, and you should go win some games.